I'm Tom Secola, and I will be your host for this webinar. All those on this webinar are FocalPoint Business Coaches from Canada and the United States. We've joined together for this Business in 360 webinar series to help business owners and executives like yourselves to think differently, to think bigger, to think more clearly about the business that you are in. If you like the information we provide, please reach out to any one of us to talk about the business coaching and how we might benefit you. So our topic today is the way to wealth. This is a conversation about going from prospects to profit and the variables that we have the ability to impact along the way. But before we get started, I want to introduce our panel. So I'm going to start with Eric. Please take it away.
Hey, Eric Rorud. I work with professional service owners and leaders to take control of their business and create balance in both their professional and personal lives.
Hi, everyone. I am Julie Entwistle. I'm a healthcare professional from Ontario, and I work with other business owners in the professional space to help them build their business confidence and competence.
Yeah, and hey team, my name's Eric De La Fuente, also known as EDLF, and I specialize in helping small business owners create additional channels of revenue through digital mediums.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Messer, and I help business leaders create more valuable companies and stronger communities.
And I'm Tom Secola, and I specialize in the development of today's new business leaders. All right, so now I'm going to ask Eric to take us through the way to wealth. And following that, we'll lead our panel in a discussion about the concept and how it applies to their areas of expertise. So, Eric, the way to wealth.
Great. Hopefully y'all can see my screen now. Way to wealth is one of these great principles I love because it really helps us take sort of complexity and make it more simple. And so at the core to way to wealth is this notion that there are really only 6 operating levers that any business can focus on to generate wealth and profit. And like I said, what I love about it is that it often business owners see the complexity in their business and really have trouble sort of narrowing down where they can focus. And so this model often helps create clarity around that. And so on its core, it's a relatively simple formula we're going to walk through and then talk about how we use this and leverage it in working with our clients. So first, the way to wealth is all about profit. And so with profit, we all start at the beginning with customers. Customers, we begin to get customers by leads, right? We start with our leads, and then with leads, we convert those leads into actual customers. Once we have customers, those customers do the next thing, and they turn it into revenue. So when we take the customers and we think about what their average sale is per customer, we then think about how many times do we interact with that customer. Usually we think about this in a year basis. Sometimes it'll be monthly. And we take that frequency of visits. How many times does that customer buy from us during that period of time? And very simply, that gets us to revenue. Once we have revenue, we move to this third part of this model, which is the expense formula. With revenue, we start to subtract out some of the costs of operating our business. The first is the cost of goods sold, or COGS, as they're often referred to. And this includes the costs that are very directly connected to the revenue. It might be commissions, it might be the actual inputs into the product. And from that, when we subtract from the revenue the COGS, we get to gross profit. From gross profit, we then remove our operating costs, which gets us to the notion of net profit. Operating costs include things like staffing, insurance, things like that make it are more core to running the business. When we put this all in one page, we get this notion of a way to wealth. What's interesting is that when I talk to clients, I often find that they don't talk about things like leads or conversion rate. They say, I don't have enough customers, I don't have enough revenue, I'm not making enough money. But what we actually find is that there are these 6 levers here: leads, conversion rate, average sale, frequency, cost of goods sold, and operating expenses are really the things that they can impact and really where conversations need to happen. And so if you're having a customer problem, well, is it a lead problem? Is it a conversion rate problem? How do we address those types of things?
Eric, it's a great explanation. Do you have a quick example you can run us through? Yeah,
absolutely, Tom. So let's just go through a straightforward example here. And we're going to do this not to demonstrate the math, but really to help you understand how we use this. And so imagine a customer that starts each year or has 1,000 leads across a year. They have a conversion rate of about 20%, which gets them to 200 customers in that year. If each customer represents $1,200 in sales and they buy from us twice a year, we end up with $480,000 worth of revenue. We then need to subtract out the cost, right? Assuming this client has 35% cost of goods sold, we end up with 168,000 of COGS, which results in a gross profit of 312,000. We then go through operating expenses at 25%, which nets us out at 192,000. What we do find is that most clients, when you actually work with them, and we'll often use a whiteboard to do this, that they'll actually know these numbers pretty close to off the top of their head, and it's not unusual for you to actually just while sitting there to be able to get to these final numbers. But where it becomes more powerful is when we talk about how we can make a difference, and it's really what can we do with improvement. And so what we'll often do is talk about one of these levers. For example, leads. You might say, okay, what can we do to generate more leads? Is it go to more networking sessions? It might be attend a conference. You might market in a new market, do more advertising in a new market. And after we talk about what those things are, we'll ask them, what do you think that might lead? So in our example here, we're going to use 10% partially because it just makes the math easy. So a 10% improvement in leads gets you to 100 extra leads or 1,100 total leads for the year. And so we would proceed, if we were working with a client, we'd proceed through each of these levers in this same fashion. For the sake of this, we're going to assume that everything is 10% and just show you sort of what that impact can be. So conversion up 10% gets you to 2% or 2% more to 22%. And so as we march down this, you'll start to see that the numbers start to increase and we start to grow the revenue just through these small increases in each of these. After that, we go down to COGS, and if you think about an increase in COGS, just remember that that would be a negative. So a 10% increase is really reducing the COGS by 3.5% or 31.5%. And as you continue down, these impacts continue to ripple down to the bottom line. And by the time you get through this, if all 6 levers were to change 10%, we've moved from $192,000 a year to $323,000. That represents a 68% increase. Now, obviously, this is a construct in this example just to show you what happens, and you wouldn't necessarily get 10% across everything in a year. But even if you were to cut that in half to 5% for everything, it's still a 31% increase. Or if you thought about the long term and actually doubled that to 20%, you get to about 170% increase. So these small changes to these levers can have a relatively big impact. And so that's where we start to have these conversations, is not at the customer level and the revenue level, but really at each of these six levers we talked about being the key to the conversation. Tom?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. So fantastic explanation. Really appreciate the way you set it up for everybody there, as well as taking us through the examples. And as you can probably imagine, there's a lot to unpack. There are a lot of different ways we can slice and dice this and look into this. And so as we continue to do this 360 series that we're doing, we'll most likely see the way to wealth again in one way or another. But with that, I'd like to kick it over to our panel to just talk about how they've seen this with some of their clients or some of the impact there. So it's all right. EDLF, I'd like to start with you. Just what your thoughts about or your experiences in working with the way to wealth.
Yeah, I think thanks, Tom. I think what you were saying, Eric, as far as the way that a lot of clients end up looking at their problems in regards to, I need more customers or I need more revenue, et cetera, and they don't kind of break it down into those individual levers. That's usually where I'll get kind of the first aha, like, I need more customers, but I don't really know what comprises that, right? Sometimes it's leads, sometimes it's the conversion, and sometimes there's other variables as well. But when you start breaking it down a little bit more, you really start to see kind of that spark of hope, so to speak. Like, yeah, increasing the number of customers I have seems kind of overwhelming and tough. But if we're talking about how can I get more people through the door, well, okay, I've got some ideas.
Some of the rest of us is she's working with more professionals who are deeper dive into hands-on. Julie, just your experience with this?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I think one of the biggest things I've noticed is that a lot of professionals don't keep the metrics required to understand the formula and how this works for them. So I usually start the conversation around tracking. Where do your leads come from? Let's talk about the different channels that bring work to you. And then we'll go into conversion and talk about how are those different lead channels being converted into customers? Which ones are more successful? What do we need to do more of? What do we need to do less of? And I think even just helping professionals to track the right information becomes a really big and first step and necessary step, and them having some insight and awareness into how to shift this formula in their favor.
Awesome. Michael, I'm sorry, I cut you off before. What you were saying?
No, not at all. One of the things that I just wanted to say, and it's dovetailing with what both EDLF and Julie just said, is that it brings a lot of clarity, because even though there's 6 levers, what I found working with clients is that there's often, depending on the circumstances of the business, 1 or 2 of those things that are really going to move the needle. So for example, I had a client once who was kind of at capacity. Business was doing great. They couldn't really, so like that almost immediately when we worked through it, you could see that it really wasn't about customers. It was about pricing. It was about frequency. It was about other things, because there was a constraint within the business. And that immediately gave us a place to start focusing our strategies for the biggest impact as soon as possible. So that's one of the things that, stripping out the noise, it also gives you that roadmap and that sort of beacon to work towards, in terms of, this is the thing that's really going to propel my business to the next level.
Love it. Yeah, I think one of the things I like about, and it's about the way to wealth, and especially the way that it's set up also, is it does also provide a roadmap in sorts. Is, you know, as we've mentioned a few times now, there's a lot of focus when we're talking with clients about the revenue, the customers, you know, but really that's the result, right? And so by laying it out like that, and so setting it up so that we can see those 6 levers, it gives some clarity, or at least an idea of where do we go to fix some of these things. It's not about your customers necessarily. It's about the leads. It's about the conversion rate. How do we dig into that? And, you know, a plan, you know, or at least gives us the idea of, we need a plan for this. How do I go about that? And that's where the brainstorming can really begin as well.
Yeah. You know, what's interesting, Tom, I also find is that as I go through this, right, and Michael made this point about finding different things, it's almost always at the revenue or customer level where people get excited and have ideas of what they can do. It's so often those ideas are in their head. I sort of self-brainstormed when I went through leads, but so often they have ideas of what they could do. But when you start to say, well, if that made that improvement by 10%, what would that mean for you? And they start to see how that's going to flow down. It helps them think about where they're spending their time, because a lot of times they spend a lot of time but on that expense line. They're focused on the expenses, right? And so, but what they get excited about is the top stuff areas, as well as it's where they have all the ideas. It's really where the core of the business is. And so you not only do they get excited, but they see the potential to get where they want.
Yeah, it's a great point on that one. Because I, like you, I find a lot of times that, you know, while the excitement comes from the upper portion of it, the focus, when people start to worry about their business, becomes on the expenses. How do I cut expenses? How do I cut this? How do I cut? There's only so far you can cut, but you can almost infinitely expand. I'm sorry, Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, just to kind of add to what you were saying, Tom, and also Eric, that part of the conversation is always interesting for me, because I think oftentimes people miss the part where the things that they're doing to improve their business, right? If you improve your leads by 10%, or you improve your, you know, some of those other revenue variables by 10%, there are costs associated with that, right? So you have to kind of manage the expense side just as well as you're managing kind of the additions on the revenue side. An example is, for instance, I was working with a client recently that was trying to just drive more traffic to their store, so increase the number of leads. And we talked about a handful of different ways they could do that, but one that they really liked was through digital marketing, specifically ads. And the reason why we landed that there is because you can create systems to predict the return on that ad spend. So as you dial up your ad spend, you'll have some type of metric that equates to the ROI on what you would get for that particular ad spend. They call it return on ad spend, or ROAS. But you can dial that down, right, if you get overwhelmed. And so if you're trying to scale your business and you're kind of at capacity, you can kind of turn it off. And so it's an easy way to think about scalability, which is what you were talking about a little bit, I think, Eric, in regards to some of the other variables that you know, people don't necessarily always pay attention to, or don't have ideas on, rather.
And I'll tell you, Eric, my time in corporate, I found that a lot of time was always spent on the expense portion of it. And I was always amazed at how often someone would be willing to spend dollars to save nickels, but they wouldn't be willing to spend nickels to earn dollars. You know, and so it's like you're talking about. I mean, if there's an advertising agency or something who can say it's cost you $5,000. You say, well, we can't afford the $5,000. Well, can you not invest the $5,000 if you know that one client might mean $10,000 in additional revenue for you? And so a lot of times it's not looking at the cost of things, but looking at it as an investment, because this is what's also going to grow your business and increase the revenue because of the customers and the conversion rate, et cetera.
Can I just add to that too? I think when I moved down the way to wealth with the people that I tend to work with, a lot of them have fixed pricing. So they have an industry set pricing to the services they provide, or there's some sort of set volume. So for example, in the healthcare space here in Canada, people may have extended health benefits, and that may be $500 for psychotherapy, psychology, social work, as an example. So when you know that the average volume is going to be $500, then how do you back that up to how many customers do I need to get to the revenue line that I'm looking for? And if I can't adjust my pricing, we can always adjust it lower, but often in professional services, we don't like to do that and undercut our professions. And if we can't adjust the volume, because we can't control if people are going to see us 3 times, if there's $500, they can come once a week and go through that in a month, or they can come twice in a week and go through that in a week. But we have to look upstream and downstream to see what other impacts we can have in terms of how the formula works out for them.
I'm curious, Julie, for that specific example, how often do you find yourself working with your clients on the concept of fulfillment? So if they're at a set price, right, and some of those things are kind of set in stone, and they try to drive more leads, eventually I'm assuming, right, a private practice owner is going to be like, well, I can't support more clients, right? I need to hire more people or whatever else. So how often does that become part of the conversation? I'm curious.
Yeah, a lot, because most solopreneurs in healthcare especially start as being the main revenue generator. So they are selling their time, and we have to track not only clients, but also visits and unbillable time. A lot of professionals spend a lot of time with clients that they can't actually capture on the revenue line. So eventually that shift needs to happen where they're either turning work away or they start to build a community of people in their practice that start taking on that overflow work from them. And that's where they move through our last cycle, that business life cycle, and they can get into a real good growth curve by making those adjustments in their practice.
Yeah, Julie, I've found a number of clients, almost a lot of times one of these levers is really kind of removed from folks, whether, you're dealing with a mortgage broker, it might be that people only get a mortgage once every, so often. And so you can't necessarily increase frequency. But then sometimes it almost says, okay, well, given what we can focus on, is there another product we can offer, right? Can I team with somebody else to generate more revenue and maybe get some revenue sharing? So even sometimes those constraints almost help focus the movement away from, well, I can't do anything because they only get a mortgage run. It's like, okay, well, that's not a lever. So let's focus on the levers that do exist, because it's not unusual that for many organizations, some of these levers, just aren't as easy to influence. But I do find even sort of eliminating some of them even helps create that focus.
Michael, I'd like to ask you one thing. Is I know from our conversations you've worked with a lot of entrepreneurs and smaller groups. How does this affect them? Are there certain areas where you think they should be focusing on, or perhaps they're not focusing on enough when they look at these?
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of the folks that I work with are not just smaller entrepreneurs, but they're social entrepreneurs or social innovators. And the thought process and the discipline that comes along with sort of simplifying and understanding what levers you want to pull to create your impact can also be translated as easily into the social space, right? So as Julie was talking about, understanding where you're spending your time and what you're tracking, what you're doing and what you're not doing, that translates really easily into, or not always easily, but it can translate into what is the impact that a social entrepreneur wants to have in addition to their revenue, in terms of what change they want to see in terms of their clients or the world around them, or whatever it is that problem that they're trying to solve. So to answer your question more directly, I think a lot of time with my clients is spent looking at not just customers, but it's the pricing and the number of touches. And then I would add like a social impact dimension to that, which is to say, what is the outcome and what is the yield for the effort in those areas to get to kind of an adjusted revenue number that encapsulates a financial return as well as a social return, if that makes sense.
Yeah, interesting. I don't think that's something that I had really thought of before. You and I had the conversation. You really explained the impact of the social aspect on it as well. So thank you.
Can I
Yeah.
just expand on what EDLF was saying, and maybe
Yeah.
in that digital marketing space, and when you list out the leads and where they come from, to EDLF's point, you've got to put a price to the cost to pursue that lead, and you do have to focus on that too. I did this with a client the other day, and within half an hour we had like 30 lead opportunities. You're not going to do them all, and so you need to decide what is the investment in that opportunity and how do you get the results. And I know that EDLF has been really successful in the digital marketing space around that. And it's interesting to look at the different opportunities and to see where they are going to generate results for you in your business.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, and I want to go back to something that Eric said earlier about not having the ability to influence some of the levers sometimes, specifically in the space that I operate in, Julie, around kind of digital marketing in particular. I get comments about, hey, it's too expensive, or I don't want to hire a team, or whatever it is, right? And sometimes those are limitations or inhibitors to kind of pulling those levers, right? Because I can't do that, or I don't have the capacity to do that, whatever the reasoning is. And so oftentimes as a coach, right, I encourage my clients to think, well, if you could, what would it look like, right? Or instead, how can you? And ultimately what ends up happening is there are ways to create additional channels of revenue that people don't think are possible because they haven't experienced it, or they don't think that that's an avenue. An example is, I was working with an insurance agent for some time, and he was telling me that advertising doesn't work for him, like online, because it's a commodity, right? He's selling, policies that people are shopping around and they're trying to find kind of the cheapest alternative. And so instead, we created a strategy where he would advertise on behalf of potential partners like mortgage brokers or real estate agents or home lenders and those types of things that would essentially refer their clients to him if they came through kind of his advertisements. And so all of a sudden, he's created an additional channel of, referral revenue that really came from his direct activities. So just something to throw out, or something to think about in regards to like, well, how can you start using some of these things if you really thought about them?
Yeah, EDLF, I think you kind of nailed like the whole value of this. It's not in the math and the formula. It's that it gets people's ideas thinking. And when you break through and start coming up with the ideas, and I think Julie said it, 30 ideas, it's getting people to think about how can they influence the things that matter, right? These levers, you generally don't influence the number of customers, but you can influence those levers. And it's that brainstorming that gets people, both excited, but also coming up with ideas and breakthroughs as to what they can be doing different. And sometimes it's even also well, I've been doing this, but it's not working very well. You're like, so why are you continuing to do that then? Or, well, that's all I've ever done, right? So it's really, it's not, this is the formula. It's a pretty straightforward formula. That's basically the formula that's behind like all economics, right? It's just that the way it helps people start to engage in thinking about what they could be doing differently to drive business and drive the growth that they're looking for.
I would say there's actually one other major benefit, and I agree with everything that you just said, which is there's so much noise. And I think you started off with this point, Eric, which is there's so much noise, and people focusing on the 6 levers, it kind of simplifies things. The other piece of this is sometimes people just think, gosh, this is such a large bogey. Like I can't ever get to this revenue because of where I'm at today or whatever. What you realize when you start working through it, and you sort of showed it with the math, is that you actually get a much bigger return by focusing on 1 or 2 levels, because there's like this accretive effect where when you're taking strategies that are kind of mutually reinforcing each other, you end up with a larger, it's not additive, it's multiplicative, right? And so I think the other big thing here, the other big takeaway that my clients see is that, you know what, the things that they thought were a 3-year plan or a 5-year plan, or perhaps impossible, are actually much closer when you brainstorm, bring some discipline to thinking about it, and being intentional about working with the 1 or 2 things that are really going to make a difference for your business. You can get much faster where you need to be than you even expected. So that's the other big thing that I would just add to what you just said.
Can I just add to, sorry, just another creative way I've used this formula is in healthcare in Canada, there's massive capacity issues. So people are struggling to find people to bring into their businesses. And if you think about it, it's the same thing. Leads in that case are how many people are calling you wanting to work with you, and where are they coming from? How are they finding you? And then how are you converting them? If you're only converting 50% of those conversations into employees or staff, well, then why are people choosing to buy and why are people choosing not to buy? So it becomes a really creative formula that you can apply to other aspects of the business as well.
I think, as we mentioned before, there's a ton of splinter discussions that we can have based on the way to wealth. There's so much we can go into, whether it's looking at the customers, the revenue, the expenses, or whatever else. And I think we're going to be seeing the way to wealth many times again in the future as we work through certain examples. But with that, I want to be conscious of time. Eric, thanks for the great demonstration on the way to wealth and the explanation. Thank you to all the panelists here for your input and your expertise. And thank you for everybody for watching. And so I ask everybody to continue to keep an eye on your social media channels. We'll be releasing our next principle with our 360 series, and really looking forward to meeting with everybody again. So thank you everybody for your time.